A night wind screamed across the frozen lake, carrying the sound of splintering ice and the desperate bark of a dog. Headlights shimmered like fractured stars over black water. The temperature had fallen below zero, cold enough to turn breath into knives. In the center of the lake, a car sagged into the cracking sheet, its rear wheels swallowed by the dark. Nearby, a German shepherd fought the elements, dragging his body forward through shards of ice, leaving a streak of red where paws met frozen glass. From the shore, a woman ran, her boots striking echoes across the night. The world had narrowed to one impossible choice: run for help or dive into danger. Her body moved before her mind caught up. The scream of the wind faded beneath the rhythm of her heartbeat and the cracking ice beneath her feet. The rescue had already begun. The glare cut through the storm like a wound, a halo of silver light against endless white. Grace Walker's truck skidded to a halt inches from the lake's edge, engine growling in protest. Her eyes caught movement on the ice, a shadow, four-legged, crawling toward a sinking car. The horizon swallowed sound. Even the storm held its breath. The engine idled as if waiting for her decision. The air reeked of gasoline and fear. Through the windshield, the headlights cast long beams that trembled over the cracking surface, illuminating chaos suspended in time. The dog's movements were deliberate, determined, as if drawn by memory instead of instinct. Grace stepped into the wind, the cold stealing her breath. Her heart didn't ask why. Some choices were louder than reason, older than survival. Somewhere beneath that frozen skin of the lake, a life was fading, and the only thing between death and mercy was her.
The dog's body was half submerged, hind legs trailing lifelessly behind. His coat, once black and gold, now shimmered with frost and blood. Steam rose from his mouth with every labored breath, brief ghosts in the air. The lake moaned under his weight, warning of the fracture to come. He crawled anyway. His eyes, amber and defiant, refused surrender. Behind him, the car tilted further, groaning like a dying beast. The dog reached the door, pressed his muzzle against the glass as if urging the figure inside to wake. The surface trembled again, a gunshot crack slicing through the storm. From the far shore came another figure, smaller, slower, human. The world held its breath between collapse and salvation. Each inch forward was an act of defiance against physics, against fate. Snow whipped across the scene, disguising heroism as struggle. The dog would not stop, even as the ice beneath him began to scream. Grace moved through snow that clawed at her legs, her coat flapping like a banner of defiance. Her flashlight beam shook with each breath, catching glimpses of the scene ahead: ice, steel, fur, and motionless water. She didn't shout. There was no point. The storm devoured sound. Her knees hit the frozen surface, hands burning against it as she crawled toward the shadow of the car. Beneath her, cracks laced outward in web-like patterns, glittering with trapped light. The air stung with the metallic tang of blood and oil. The dog turned its head, eyes locking with hers across the distance. Two souls equally unwilling to yield. The wind howled between them, bending trees on the far shore. Grace's muscles trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of a memory she couldn't bury. The same stretch of road, the same month, the same impossible choice. Only this time, she refused to lose.
When she reached him, the animal was nearly still. Frosts clung to his whiskers, forming tiny constellations in the dim light. Her glove brushed against a strip of leather buried under ice and fur, a collar stiff with frost. The tag swung gently, catching the flashlight beam. 4 words etched by a trembling hand: "If found, keep him." Beneath, a single initial, D. The words carried the weight of surrender. Whoever wrote them had chosen absence over cruelty, the final act disguised as mercy. Grace felt the cold through her bones, the air biting deeper as she traced the letters. Around them, the lake shifted like a living thing. The car sank further, groaning into silence. The dog's eyes met hers again, dull but not empty. She whispered nothing. The storm's roar replaced language. The note wasn't just a plea for rescue, It was the confession of someone who'd already given up. The words carved themselves into her mind, relentless and cruel. They echoed louder than the wind, louder than the sound of the cracking ice beneath her. The tag dangled like an accusation, swinging between them in the blizzard's breath. Grace lifted the dog, his body heavy and awkward, the dead weight of suffering made physical. Warm blood seeped through her sleeves, staining the snow where she knelt. Behind her, the headlights flickered as if struggling against the cold. The car slipped beneath the surface, swallowed by darkness. She turned away, clutching the animal to her chest, a shivering heartbeat against her own. The shore was only 30 yards away, but the wind turned distance into eternity. Each step was war. She stumbled once, twice, knees slicing into ice shards. Somewhere inside the storm, the echo of a young boy's voice rose and fell, reminding her what loss had already taken.
The dog's body pressed against her, a furnace of pain and determination. Grace staggered through the drifts, her muscles screaming with every movement. Each breath carved frost against her lips. The dog's paws hung limp, leaving streaks of red where they brushed the snow. Her pulse beat in her ears, loud and desperate. The blizzard erased the world into white noise. No horizon, no sound, just motion. Behind her, the hole in the ice closed over like a wound sealing itself. The weight in her arms wasn't just the animal. It was 3 winters of grief, all the miles she hadn't driven since Noah died. The storm burned her lungs, but stopping meant failure, and failure was something she'd already buried once. The cabin lights flickered faintly ahead, blurred by distance and snow. The faintest suggestion of salvation. She didn't pray. She only moved. Survival, for both of them, demanded it. Wind turned the night into a shifting curtain of white, the same kind that had swallowed Noah 3 years before. Grace saw flashes, the police lights, the paramedics, the way snow had covered his car before she arrived. Every step toward her truck carried that memory like a ghost walking beside her. The dog whimpered once, faintly, pulling her back to the present. His breath steamed against her arm, thin and fading. She fumbled with the handle, wrestled open the frozen door, and laid him across the seat. For a moment she simply stood there, snow clinging to her hair, heartbeat hammering against silence. The world looked identical to the night she lost everything, yet this time she had something still breathing beside her. The repetition of tragedy felt like a dare. The universe was asking if she'd choose differently. She closed the door, turned the key, and let the engine roar.
The drive to Glacier Ridge felt endless. Snow blurred the lines between road and wilderness. Grace's hands shook on the wheel, knuckles pale against the steering column. The heat inside the truck couldn't touch the cold in her chest. Once she had been a nurse, the kind who stayed through double shifts, who believed every life could be pulled back from the edge. But death had broken that faith. Her son's car had been found in a ditch much like this, his body trapped under twisted metal. She hadn't worked a hospital shift since. The dashboard light flickered over Rex's face, his eyes half closed, chest rising shallowly. Grace pressed harder on the accelerator, her pulse syncing with the hum of the tires. Somewhere beyond the storm waited a sterile room, bright lights, another stranger's judgment. She would face all of it if it meant one living thing didn't die tonight. The clinic's lights appeared like a mirage through the storm, sterile and steady. Grace pulled to the curb, adrenaline replacing exhaustion. The glass doors slid open to warmth and fluorescent glare. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, sharp, clean, merciless. A team of hands moved around the dog, placing him on a steel table, wires and tubes blooming from his body like lifelines. Grace stood motionless, boots dripping meltwater, unable to speak. The rhythmic beeps of machinery replaced the blizzard's howl. Beyond the window, snow continued to fall, relentless and indifferent. She watched as professionals did what she could no longer do, fight for another heartbeat.
Her reflection in the glass showed hollow eyes and trembling hands, but in the table's reflection lay a flicker of life. Somewhere between the hum of machines and the hush of falling snow, the dog's chest lifted. Hope, fragile and frightening, began again.
Morning came without sunlight. The storm had buried the parking lot, muffling the world in white. Inside the clinic, Grace sat in a chair that groaned each time she shifted, her coat stiff with thawed ice. The estimate lay on her lap, numbers she couldn't afford written in cold ink. She had always believed compassion was free until she learned what survival cost. Her own heart pills waited at home in an amber bottle half empty. The nurse's voice had sounded kind when she handed her the paper, kind in that professional way that still meant final. Grace folded the estimate without reading it again. Outside, the storm had ended, but silence was heavier than wind. She walked to the recovery window, watching Rex sleep beneath the heating lamp. Machines whispered around him. She touched the glass between them, calculating debts that could never be paid in money alone. 3 weeks earlier, Grace had turned 62. The calendar on her refrigerator still marked the date in red ink she'd forgotten to wash off. She hadn't celebrated a birthday since Noah's death. Each year felt like a trespass she hadn't earned. Now, in the clinic hallway, time folded around her again. The nurse mentioned a form, a date, a birth year, and Grace caught the number like a blow. Her hands looked older than she remembered. The world outside those glass doors was young, cruelly so, the kind that still believed winter was temporary. Inside, the clock above the surgical room pulsed forward, marking seconds of borrowed grace. The faint rhythmic sound of Rex's breathing synced with her heartbeat, a metronome reminding her she was still here. Birthdays, deaths, rescues, they blurred together, proof of nothing except endurance. She closed her eyes, wondering if love could still exist without celebration.
The hum of the clinic became a distant tide, washing memories against her consciousness. She heard Noah's laughter from years before, small and unbroken, echoing through the sterile corridors. She saw him again, the way he'd looked the night before his accident, hair damp from snow, backpack slung over one shoulder. The image flickered like old film, grainy, unreal. The vet's voice pulled her back, explaining nerve damage and percentages, but she heard only the rhythm of loss, the steady heartbeat of things slipping away. Outside, a plow groaned, pushing drifts aside. She pressed her palm against the glass partition that separated her from Rex, feeling the vibration of his shallow breath. It sounded like Noah's last one, the one she hadn't been there to catch. The past and present folded together, indistinguishable, both asking the same question: how much pain could one heart bear and still keep beating? The collar lay in a clear plastic bag on the counter, condensation forming on its surface from the warmth of the room. Grace turned it over in her gloved hand. The initial seemed almost burned into the leather, rough and desperate. D. A person who had owned enough hope to buy a fine collar, then abandoned it in the snow. It didn't fit cruelty, it fit remorse. She imagined hands tightening that collar around Rex's neck one last time, whispering promises that never survived winter. The vet mentioned microchip records, but the details blurred. She only saw that letter. Some stories begin with names, others end there. Grace felt an odd kinship with the invisible stranger who'd failed the same way she had, with love that arrived too late. Outside, a plow light swept across the parking lot, carving temporary gold lines into the snow, the same color as Rex's fur.
Rehabilitation began the next morning. The vet techs lifted Rex carefully, placing his front paws on a foam pad, the rest of his body supported by straps. Grace stood by the wall, hands clenched until her nails bit skin. Each motion drew a low whimper from the dog, soft but filled with effort. The room smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Pain marked every small victory, an involuntary twitch, a tremor of muscle beneath bandaged skin. Grace watched in silence, feeling something awaken that had long slept in her. This was what healing looked like. Not triumph, but endurance. Every sound he made echoed her own inner noise, the one she'd hidden for years. She didn't know if he understood she was there, but his eyes found her anyway. In that shared glance lay a silent contract to keep fighting even when living felt heavier than dying. That night, sleep refused to come. The wind outside the cabin returned, whispering through the eaves like a familiar ghost. Grace sat wrapped in an old blanket, watching snow drift past the window. The fire cracked, but even its warmth couldn't touch the cold threaded through her chest. Somewhere between waking and memory, she heard Noah's voice again. Softer this time, childlike, the tone he used before fear existed. She blinked hard, but the sound stayed. Maybe it wasn't madness, but maybe grief simply learned to speak in echoes. She closed her eyes and imagined him standing at the window, hand pressed to the glass, smiling the way he did when storms excited him. Outside, the wind rose, circling the cabin like breath over an open wound. The voice faded, leaving only the steady ticking of the clock and the reminder that ghosts never truly leave, they just change form.
2 weeks later, the envelope arrived, plain white against the gray morning. The handwriting was masculine, hurried, unfamiliar, no return address, the postmark nearly erased by cold. Grace tore it open without expectation, but the first sentence stole her breath. Words written by someone drowning in guilt, describing a love too heavy to carry. As she read, the paper trembled in her hands. The writer spoke of a dog, of an accident, of a failure that left scars on more than fur. At the bottom lay a check, folded twice, corners worn. $15,000, signed by a name she had never heard, Daniel Carter. Outside, the wind shifted direction, as if it too had heard confession. She sat in silence, surrounded by the hum of the refrigerator and the low groan of the heater, the ordinary sounds of life continuing while someone, somewhere, begged for forgiveness. The letter stayed open on the table for hours. Grace reread the line that had broken her. "I loved him too much to watch him suffer." The words felt like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. The man's guilt bled through every stroke of ink. He had driven away from the dog, believing abandonment was mercy, believing pain could be spared by distance. The justification was one she understood too well. She had told herself the same thing about people, patience, family, her own son. Walking away sometimes felt like the only way to keep from breaking entirely. Yet as she sat there, surrounded by snowlight filtering through the window, the truth settled like dust. Love that doesn't stay isn't love at all, just fear wearing its clothes. The check fluttered slightly in the draft, the smallest motion of unspent redemption.
She drove back to the clinic, the check folded in her coat pocket like a secret. The road glittered with ice, sunlight reflecting off the drifts like shards of glass. When she handed the paper to the receptionist, the woman's eyes widened. Grace said nothing, only nodded toward Rex's recovery room. Money had never felt so heavy. It wasn't a gift, it was a ghost trying to buy peace. In the treatment ward, Rex lifted his head at her approach, tail moving faintly against the blanket. The machines hummed, a fragile orchestra keeping him tethered to life. She stood there for a long time, not praying, not thinking, just breathing the same air as something still fighting. Outside, the sky began to clear, leaving the kind of blue that arrives only after storms, deep, exhausted, and full of fragile promises. At the clinic's front desk, she asked for the microchip record. The computer hummed, pulling data from invisible networks. The name appeared on the screen, Daniel Carter, Whitefish, Montana. The address listed was the same as the letter's postmark. The number beside it had been disconnected. She copied it onto a scrap of paper and slipped it into her pocket without speaking. The receptionist smiled the way people do when they know something matters but don't ask. Grace walked out into the cold, the parking lot shining with fresh ice. She stood there for a long moment, the paper clutched in her hand, as if holding it might tether her to the stranger whose guilt had bought one more day for a broken dog. Somewhere in town, a man with that name lived with his choices, unaware that redemption had just found his trail.
Nights in Whitefish carried their own kind of quiet, heavy enough to press against the glass. Grace noticed it first as a shift in the air, the sense of being observed. From the edge of the porch, headlights flickered once, then vanished down the street. It happened again the next night, and again a week later. Sometimes the shape lingered, barely visible beyond the tree line, unmoving except for the faint spark of a cigarette. She tried to ignore it, telling herself grief created phantoms. But Rex noticed too. His ears would rise, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside the window. Whatever haunted them was not a ghost. In the reflection of the glass, Grace saw her own eyes beside his, both locked on the same patch of night. The snow carried fresh prints by morning, boots, not paws, disappearing toward Pine Street. The third time it happened, the figure stepped closer to the porch light, far enough that the storm's veil thinned. Rex's reaction changed. Instead of fear, his body leaned forward, tail low but wagging faintly. Recognition, not alarm. The dog pressed his nose against the glass, whined low in his throat. Grace froze. The silhouette stood there motionless, shoulders hunched, a man watching his past through the barrier of cold and regret. Then, as headlights from a passing truck swept over the yard, he vanished. The snow where he'd stood was unbroken. Inside, Rex turned in circles, restless, unsettled, eyes wide with something deeper than instinct. Grace touched his fur, feeling the tremor that wasn't quite fear. Somewhere out in the night, the name Daniel Carter carried weight again. Ghosts did not leave footprints, but guilt often did, marked into snow by shoes that never stopped walking.
Eve Porter watched from across the road, arms folded tight in her winter coat. The old woman had lived in the neighborhood for decades, long enough to see every mistake repeat itself. She came over one afternoon, uninvited but certain of her place. Her eyes lingered on Rex, then on Grace. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the blunt kindness of someone too old for gentle lies. She warned against attachment, against pouring love into things destined to vanish. Grace nodded politely, but her mind drifted to the figure in the snow and the letter marked with guilt. The advice made sense, yet something in her refused it. Love that could be lost was the only kind she'd ever known. When Eve left, the scent of cinnamon tea remained on the porch, warm and ghost-like. Through the window, Rex watched the street again, waiting for something only he remembered. The message came from the clinic's office. Another payment had been made toward Rex's ongoing care. No name attached, only an untraceable online receipt. The amount was $10,000, too specific to be coincidence. Grace sat at her kitchen table, the screen's glow lighting her tired face. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes spiraling downward like forgotten promises. The donor's anonymity screamed the same silence as the letter. It wasn't charity, it was penance. The realization chilled her more than the wind that slipped through the window cracks. Someone out there was watching, not out of curiosity, but obligation. The thought brought no comfort, only the unease of unfinished stories still moving through the dark. Rex slept by the fire, twitching in dreams that looked like memory. Every breath he took reminded her that someone else's guilt was keeping him alive.
Exhaustion came quietly, the way winter sneaks through poorly sealed doors. Weeks of tending, lifting, cleaning, and medication had stripped her body to survival's edge. That night, she stood too fast. The the room tilting into a slow spiral. The mug fell first, shattering against the floor. Then the world went white. When she opened her eyes, she was on the kitchen tiles, Rex whining beside her, nudging her shoulder. The ceiling lights spun above like a fading star. Her heart stuttered, a fragile rhythm trying to find its way back. The taste of iron filled her mouth. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls, indifferent. Somewhere far away, the dog began to howl, long, mournful, pulling from something older than language. It carried through the neighborhood until porch lights flicked on one by one. Within minutes, the world she had hidden from finally came to her door. The neighbors found her sprawled near the counter, still breathing but colorless, Rex standing guard over her body. His fur was damp with melted snow from the open door. The ambulance came with its red lights bleeding into the white of the storm. He wouldn't move until the paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher, his gaze fixed on her face. The dog's cry followed her down the driveway, a sound that silenced even the wind. In the hospital, monitors took over the rhythm her heart couldn't manage alone. Back at the cabin, Eve stayed with Rex, her hands clumsy but kind as she cleaned the mess from the floor. The old woman spoke softly, though the dog didn't need comfort. He needed her scent, her voice, his pulse. Outside, snow erased every footprint, but one truth remained. The dog she saved had just saved her in return.
Dr. Alan Mercer arrived at the hospital before dawn, his coat dusted with snow and eyes clouded with fatigue. He stood at the foot of Grace's bed, reading monitors, pretending professionalism could disguise emotion. She had been his patient once before, when grief had nearly claimed her after Noah. This time the reason wore fur. When she woke, his relief was silent but unmistakable. Later, in the hallway, he spoke to the billing clerk, lowering his voice, signing quietly on a form. She would never see the extra column marked adjusted, nor know the amount he'd covered himself. Mercy, he believed, didn't need witnesses. Outside, snow began to melt into gray slush, the season turning, the world exhaling. In his office later, he ran a hand over Rex's file, closed it gently, and left the lights burning longer than usual, as though warmth alone could keep her safe. Recovery came unevenly. Rex's progress stalled, then reversed. One morning he refused to stand, his hind legs limp again, his breathing shallow. Grace sat on the floor beside him, back pressed against the wall, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The vet said inflammation, temporary setback, but she recognized the tone, the same one doctors had used with her years ago. Outside, the first thaw began, water running beneath the snow. She could smell damp earth through the cracked window. Each small sound in the house magnified, clock ticking, furnace sighing, the faint rattle of pills in their bottle. It felt like a replay of every decline she'd witnessed, every helpless moment when love wasn't enough. She pressed her palm to Rex's back, feeling the warmth struggle against the cold, whispering something without words, the kind of promise made only to the dying.
That night, she sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding an old prescription bottle between trembling fingers. The label had faded. The pills inside rattled softly, a lullaby for the hopeless. The mirror across from her reflected a stranger, hair grayer, eyes hollow, mouth set in a line of exhaustion. The house was silent except for the low hum of the heater and Rex's distant breathing. Outside, the wind picked up, scraping branches against the roof like fingernails. She thought about Noah, about the blizzard, about the way the world had taken everything she loved without explanation. The pills felt cool in her hand, a simple exit wrapped in plastic. She poured them onto her palm and waited for courage or collapse. Then a sound rose from the bedroom, long, aching, alive. A howl so full of fear and devotion that it fractured the silence clean in two.
The sound pierced through the closed door, through her heartbeat, through every layer of numbness she'd built. It wasn't just noise, it was need, raw and immediate. Grace dropped the pills. They scattered across the tile like tiny white bones. She stumbled into the hallway, her vision swimming, her knees shaking. In the bedroom, Rex was struggling, front legs clawing at the blanket, eyes wide, searching for her. He had felt it, the withdrawal of her will, the tilt toward absence. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his. His fur was cold, his breath ragged, but he was alive, and in his eyes was an accusation she could not escape. She stayed there until dawn, the two of them tangled in quiet survival. Outside, the storm finally broke, light, bleeding through the curtains. She whispered nothing, but the silence carried the only truth left. They would keep living.
Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin window, pale and uncertain. Grace sat cross-legged on the rug beside Rex, coaxing him through the same movements she'd repeated for weeks. His muscles trembled under her hands. For a long moment, nothing happened, and one paw shifted, then another. He braced, wobbled, and rose. 3 full seconds upright. The world seemed to stop around them, holding its breath in reverence for the fragile miracle. When he collapsed, she caught him, laughing and crying at once, the sounds blending into something unfamiliar. Joy. The house smelled of antiseptic and wet fur, but for the first time it also smelled of life. Rex licked her sleeve, the gesture awkward and pure. She pressed her forehead to his, eyes closed, feeling the rhythm of survival pass between them. 3 seconds had rewritten everything she believed about endings. She recorded it almost without thinking, a small clip of movement, a tail's uncertain wag, a dog's body learning how to stand again. By evening, it had spread across the internet, the video shared by strangers hungry for proof that hope could survive. Messages poured in from distant cities, people writing about their own rescues, their own broken hearts. Donations multiplied. Grace didn't understand how the story traveled so far or why it mattered to anyone else, but the screen filled with love she couldn't hold. She watched the numbers climb like rising temperature on a frozen day, warmth built from empathy instead of sunlight. Outside, the snow melted in uneven patches, the first brown grass showing through. She turned from the computer to Rex, who was asleep by the fire, unaware that his struggle had become a beacon for thousands. Healing, it seemed, was contagious.
Bathing Rex had become routine. Warm water, careful touch, patience learned through repetition. As she worked through the tangles in his fur, her fingers caught on something hard sewn into the inner lining of his collar. She pried it open, revealing a tiny laminated photo, edges worn smooth. A little girl, 6 or 7, hugged a younger version of Rex. Her smile was sunlight. The back bore childish handwriting in blue marker. Mia and Rex, best friends forever. Grace stared until her eyes blurred, the world narrowing to ink and memory that didn't belong to her. The collar dripped onto the floor, leaving small dark spots on the wood. The discovery turned the dog's story from tragedy to inheritance. Someone had loved him first. She set the photo beside the drying towel and whispered the name once, tasting it like a prayer, Mia. The photo became an anchor in her mind, a promise that refused to fade. She carried it everywhere, between pages of a notebook, inside her coat pocket, next to the folded letter from Daniel Carter. Together they told a half story, a father, a child, a broken animal, and the silence between them. Grace began researching, tracing property records and old phone numbers that led nowhere. The search pulled her deeper into memories she'd avoided, the way grief clings to determination like frost to glass. At night, she sat by the window while Rex slept, studying the photograph under lamplight. The girl's missing tooth, the bright summer sky, the trust in the dog's posture.
It all felt too alive to end in a snowbank. Outside, spring wind moved through the trees, whispering the same words she'd repeated all week: find her.
Purpose returned like a pulse. Every morning began with coffee, lists, and quiet resolve. Grace called every clinic within 50 miles, asked about missing German shepherds, about families who might have moved away. Most conversations ended politely, offering nothing. Yet she felt closer with each call, as if persistence itself carried direction. Rex followed her through the house, resting his chin on her lap when she paused too long. The photo of Mia stayed pinned to the refrigerator, a compass she no longer questioned. Outside, the landscape thawed into mud and running water, the earth breathing again after months of stillness. Grace felt the same slow stirring inside herself, something thawing that she thought had died with her son. She no longer moved to forget, she moved to connect, to restore what winter had scattered. Hope, she realized, required constant motion. The address from the letter led her to the edge of town, where snow still clung to shaded lawns. The house at 412 Pine Street sat empty, windows covered with real estate stickers, paint peeling from the porch. A foreclosure sign leaned crookedly in the yard. She parked across the street, engine idling, staring at the place that had once held laughter. Through the front window she glimpsed remnants, a curtain still hanging, a child's drawing taped to the wall. Dust coated everything like a second snowfall. The silence of abandonment was unmistakable. She stepped out, her boots crunching against gravel, and peered through the glass. The reflection staring back was her own, older and wiser in grief. The story she sought had already moved on, but its echoes still lived in the hollow rooms. She left a note tucked under the door. "I found Rex. He's safe."
Finding Laura took 3 more weeks of calls and false leads. When she finally opened her door, the woman looked much older than her 30-something years, eyes lined by exhaustion that spoke louder than words. Grace recognized the expression instantly. It was the look of someone who had survived guilt's long winter. Inside the small apartment, boxes were stacked in corners, half-packed. A child's shoes rested by the door. Grace showed the photo. Laura stared, covering her mouth with her hand. The story poured out in fragments: an accident, a husband's breakdown, a family dismantled. Grace listened, piecing together the tragedy that had begun where hers might have ended. The dog she'd found in the snow had once been part of this woman's heartbeat. When Grace left, Laura stood in the doorway long after the car disappeared, the photo clutched like proof that love could return. Laura's story replayed in Grace's mind during the drive home. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, each drop a metronome for regret. Daniel had been driving late one night after an argument, Rex in the back seat. The road turned icy, the car swerved, and in the crash that followed, the dog's spine had been crushed. Laura had taken their daughter, Mia, and left before guilt could consume them all. Grace pictured the scene, the red taillight spinning into black, the silent witness of snow falling on wreckage. She realized the stranger who had written the letter had lived in that moment ever since, trapped between apology and disappearance. The details settled over her like ash. Accidents never end where they happen. They echo through everyone left standing. She turned onto the dark road leading home, headlights carving thin lines through the rain.
In the days that followed, Grace noticed the watcher again. This time, under the pale glow of the street lamp, she recognized the posture, the slump of shoulders, the weary gait. It matched the handwriting from the letter, the tone of remorse she'd memorized. Daniel Carter wasn't a phantom, he was alive, haunting the perimeter of his own mistakes. He never approached, only stood where light ended and night began. Rex sensed him instantly, tail low but wagging, a soundless greeting through glass. Grace understood then that his midnight visits had never stopped. Guilt had turned the man into a ghost who couldn't leave the living. The thought filled her with both anger and pity. Redemption was close enough for him to touch, yet he stayed outside, afraid of forgiveness. She drew the curtain closed, knowing some hauntings required courage from both sides. When Grace went to the elementary school to post a notice for animal therapy volunteers, a teacher recognized the photograph pinned to her clipboard. Karen Whitfield, her badge read. She mentioned seeing a man matching Daniel's description near the playground fence on several nights, never approaching, just standing there watching the children. At first it had frightened her. Now it only made her sad. Grace's stomach tightened. The image of a father watching his daughter from beyond the fence settled heavy in her chest. Karen promised to call if she saw him again. Driving home, Grace felt the weight of unfinished redemption pressing close. She realized the man she sought wasn't lost at all. He was orbiting his past, waiting for permission to return. As she turned onto her street, Rex lifted his head in the back seat, ears pricked, as if he already knew what came next.
Grace checked her security footage the next morning, heart steady but cold. The recording showed the same shadowed figure appearing at 2 a.m. night after night, sometimes closer, sometimes standing across the street, motionless except for breath fogging in the winter air. 47 appearances in 3 months, always at the same hour, always leaving before dawn. The pattern was too deliberate for coincidence. She watched Rex in the footage, each time he rose before the man appeared, as if sensing him through walls, his tail wagging faintly in recognition. The evidence was undeniable. Daniel Carter had never stopped watching. Guilt had its own schedule, precise and cruel. Grace closed the laptop and stared into the still room, realizing that sometimes love didn't vanish. It simply stood outside in the cold, waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. Saturday arrived wrapped in pale light and thin clouds. Grace had been expecting them since the call, yet the knock still startled her. When she opened the door, Laura Carter stood on the porch with her daughter Mia, small hand clasped tightly in hers. The girl's coat was too large, her eyes too old for 8 years. Snowmelt dripped from the porch roof, the slow rhythm of time catching up. Grace felt the moment tilt between grief and grace. Behind her, Rex barked once, sharp and questioning. The child flinched at the sound, then froze, searching for what she dared not believe. Grace stepped aside, letting them in. The scent of coffee and antiseptic lingered in the air. Mia's gaze traveled past her toward the living room where a shadow moved, heavy and waiting. The house held its breath.
Mia stood in the doorway, uncertain. Her small body leaned forward, every muscle pulled toward memory. Grace watched her and recognized the expression, the mixture of hope and terror that precedes recognition. The room fell silent, except for the ticking clock. Sunlight slid through the window, touching the worn fur of the dog who had once been her playmate. Grace wanted to speak, but found no words strong enough to hold what hung in the air. She stepped back instead, letting space do the talking. The girl took a single step, then another. Her breath quickened, not from fear, but from remembering too much, too young. Rex's ears twitched. The stillness fractured, not with sound, but with a small intake of breath that felt like a world beginning again. The first sound was a gasp, then movement. Rex dragged himself forward with a sudden burst of strength that seemed to come from memory itself. His nails scratched the floor, his tail thumped weakly, his whole body trembling under the strain. Mia's knees hit the rug, her hands reaching before reason could intervene. They collided in a tangle of limbs and fur, stillness giving way to sobs muffled against each other. Grace looked away, the intimacy too pure for witness. Light from the window washed over them, turning their outline into something holy. The clock ticked on, marking seconds in a moment that would live forever in both of them. When Grace turned back, the dog's head rested in the girl's lap, eyes half closed, peace replacing years of pain.
No language could match what recognition had already said. The house felt alive again, echoing with soft noises, Rex's uneven breathing, the child's quiet laughter breaking into tears, Laura's attempts to steady herself in the doorway. Grace stood apart, feeling warmth spread through rooms that had known only silence. The reunion was a wound and a cure stitched together, each heartbeat sealing what loss had torn open. Time bent in that small space, years of guilt, months of recovery, a lifetime of regret, all folded into one afternoon. The dog leaned against Mia's knees, his trust absolute, his forgiveness effortless. Grace realized that healing wasn't about erasing scars, it was about learning to live inside them. When the clock struck noon, sunlight reached the picture on the mantel, the one of Noah, and for the first time, it didn't hurt to look. Afternoon light softened the room into amber and gold. The visit stretched longer than planned. No one could bear to end it. Mia moved through the cabin like someone rediscovering home, touching Rex's toys, tracing the scars along his back with gentle fingers. Laura sat with Grace in quiet understanding, their griefs intertwining without words. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, filling the air with the scent of tea. Time passed, unnoticed. Outside, the snow began to fall again, each flake descending like the slow turning of forgiveness. When it was finally time to go, Mia resisted, her arms wrapped around Rex, refusing to let go. Grace felt something inside her splinter and heal at the same time. Love had always been temporary, but this felt eternal.
When the car pulled away, the silence it left behind filled every corner of the house. Rex limped to the window and stayed there, nose pressed against the cold glass, eyes fixed on the direction they'd gone. Grace stood beside him, her reflection merging with his. The sound of tires faded, replaced by the hush of falling snow. For the first time in months, she felt powerless again. The dog refused food, refused rest, weeding as though the separation were punishment. Outside, the road disappeared under white, and darkness settled early. Grace placed her hand on the window pane, tracing the faint outline of his paw beside it. Hope was a fragile creature, she thought, easily broken, endlessly resurrected. The night swallowed the last light, leaving only the two of them and the ache of everything unfinished. The morning began wrong. The house was too quiet, the air too still. Grace called once, twice, and panic rose when no sound answered. The back door stood ajar, wind breathing through the crack. Outside, fresh snow revealed the story, drag marks leading from the porch to the fence's weak section. The boards hung loose, one snapped clean through. He had gone out alone. Her breath caught, heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled on her coat, grabbed the keys, and ran to the truck. The engine roared to life, tires spinning through ice. The landscape blurred past in streaks of white and pine green. Every minute stretched longer than grief. Somewhere ahead, a crippled dog was crawling through winter towards something he refused to die without finding.
Reports began trickling in through phone calls and social posts. A dog in a wheelchair heading toward downtown. Then another sighting near Pine Street. Grace's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel as she followed the trail of clues. 3 miles of frozen sidewalks, intersections, and silence. Rex had dragged himself across it all. She pictured the raw skin, the burning lungs, the singular focus. He wasn't lost. He was going somewhere, drawn by memories stronger than pain. Snow dusted the world in soft brightness, disguising every wound he left behind. Grace pulled to the curb near the old school, stepping out into air that burned with cold and fear. Somewhere close, a child's laughter cut through the wind, followed by shouts. Hope sparked like a flare inside her chest. A crowd had gathered by the chain-link fence, children and parents forming a ring around the figure at its center. Grace pushed through them, her breath catching as she saw Rex, muddy, exhausted, sitting proudly in the snow with his tail sweeping weakly. In front of him, Mia knelt, her arms locked around his neck, face buried in his fur. The teacher from the elementary stood nearby, phone trembling in her hand, tears on her cheeks. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the playground equipment, the faint clink of Rex's tag against his collar. He had crawled 3 miles through ice to find the girl who'd once called him home. Grace stood still, the scene shimmering before her like a vision. Some rescues, she thought, were mutual. Some miracles walked on 4 legs.
Grace moved through the crowd toward Rex and Mia, her heart pounding harder than the gold allowed. The sight of them together pulled every muscle in her chest tight. Parents whispered, children pointed, and someone called her name. She barely heard. When she reached them, Rex looked up, tail twitching once before collapsing against the snow, spent but peaceful. Grace sank to her knees, her hand trembling as it found his heartbeat, faint but steady. The noise of the world blurred, replaced by the slow rhythm beneath her palm. People offered help, phones, blankets, but she was already lost inside the moment. All that mattered was that the impossible had happened. Rex had made it back to the reason he lived. The ambulance sirens began to wail in the distance, slicing through the hush like a promise that this time everyone would survive. Miles away, Daniel Carter sat in his car, parked on the edge of Whitefish Lake. The sky pressed low and colorless above him, the water below shifting beneath a thin crust of ice. His breath fogged the windshield in uneven bursts. On the passenger seat lay the empty bottle of pills he'd meant to finish weeks ago, the same kind that once filled Grace's bathroom. The letter he'd written to no one sat folded beside it, ink smeared by his hands. Guilt had aged him faster than grief. His reflection in the window looked like a man already halfway gone. Somewhere behind him, faint sirens echoed through the stillness, but he didn't turn. He reached for the ignition, knowing exactly where the road across the lake led. Some endings, he thought, were rehearsed too many times to stop.
He drove slowly, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the fog. The bottle rattled in the cup holder as the tires found their way onto the frozen surface. The lake looked endless, a glass sheet reflecting nothing but the pale outline of his car. The sound of cracking echoed beneath him, subtle at first, then louder, like bones under pressure. He stopped near the center, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was sharp enough to hurt. The world held its breath, suspended between stillness and collapse. He thought of Laura, of Mia, of the dog he'd left bleeding in the snow. He whispered something only the wind heard, an apology without words. The ice responded with a groan that sounded almost human. The surface flexed, the line of cracks spreading outward like veins beneath transparent skin. The ice began to fracture beneath Daniel's feet, the black water below rising to meet him. Wind tore through his jacket, carrying snow across the widening cracks. He stepped closer to the edge, where light met shadow, where the world tilted toward nothing. He thought of the note he had written, "If found, keep him," and wondered if mercy and surrender had always been the same thing. His reflection wavered in the dark water, a ghostly silhouette trembling between earth and sky. For a moment he hesitated, not from fear but fatigue. Above him the sky opened in a flurry of white, and for the first time in years he felt small, almost forgiven. Then the ice gave way, the sound sharp as breaking glass. The lake swallowed him whole.
At the same moment, miles away, Rex stirred from where he lay wrapped in blankets. His eyes opened abruptly, ears twitching. He lifted his head as if hearing something beyond sound itself, a pull older than memory. Grace saw the change, the sudden focus, the faint whine that broke through his throat. Before she could react, he struggled upright, dragging himself toward the edge of the playground, toward the road. His body trembled with exhaustion, but something stronger than pain guided him. Grace followed, calling his name in vain. He limped, stumbled, then broke into a crawl. The wind rose, carrying a scent, a vibration, something invisible. The crowd watched as he disappeared toward the north, his shadow stretching long across the snow. Instinct, not choice, led him back to the one soul still drowning. The sound reached her faintly at first, a distant echo over the frozen plain, a bark threaded through wind. Grace felt the air shift, the same way it had the night she first found him. Something in her bones recognized the pattern. She climbed into her truck, heart hammering, and followed the direction the dog had taken. The town blurred past, sirens behind her, the road ahead slick and glinting. Clouds rolled low, pressing the horizon into darkness. When she reached the lake, she saw fresh tire tracks leading out onto the ice, and, beside them, the dragging trail of paws. Her headlights swept over the expanse, catching motion near the center, Rex moving toward a sinking shadow. Grace left the engine running and ran. The cold burned her lungs, but she didn't slow. The sound of the ice cracking was louder now, closer, desperate.
The vehicle's rear was already submerged, front end tilted skyward, lights flickering under the surface. Rex clawed forward across the widening cracks, slipping with every lunge. Grace's boots hit the ice hard, the surface trembling beneath her weight. Wind howled across the lake, flattening her breath. She crawled the last few yards, water seeping through the seams of her gloves, her muscles locking with cold. The driver's side window had shattered inward, a dark figure barely visible inside. The man's head hung against the steering wheel, motionless. She recognized the jacket before the face, Daniel Carter's final confession made flesh. Rex reached him first, pressing against the door, barking weakly. Grace grabbed the handle. The ice shrieked beneath them like a warning. She pulled anyway. Water surged up, biting at her arms as she gripped Daniel's coat, hauling him through the broken window. The lake's blackness clawed for both of them, the cold, numbing thought and movement. Rex barked, circling, his paws slipping on the slick surface. Grace dragged the man toward shallower ice, every motion agony. The weight of his soaked body felt endless, but instinct overpowered fear. She remembered the same frozen breath years ago, another car, another rescue she had arrived too late for. Not this time. Her hands locked, pulling until her muscles screamed. Then the surface held. The ice beneath them stopped groaning. Daniel coughed once, twice, water spilling from his mouth. Rex collapsed beside them, chest heaving. The night went silent except for breathing, the sound of 3 lives reclaiming their place among the living.
By the time the sirens reached the lake, Grace was half-conscious, clinging to the edge of the shattered ice. Flashlights bobbed through the storm, voices shouting orders she barely understood. Hands pulled her up, wrapped blankets around her, lifted Daniel onto a stretcher. Rex lay curled near her feet, shivering violently, his eyes half-closed but aware. The world blurred into color and noise, red lights, white snow, blue uniforms. Someone pressed oxygen against her face. Another voice called her name. She looked toward Daniel as they loaded him into the ambulance. His chest rose unevenly, but it rose. Rex shifted, nudging her leg once as if to confirm it was over. In that frozen tableau of chaos and mercy, the story that had begun with one broken animal came full circle. Later, at the hospital, the machines hummed again. Different room, same rhythm. Daniel lay asleep under thin sheets, his pulse visible in the monitor's glow. Grace stood at the foot of his bed, still wrapped in hospital blankets, Rex resting beside her chair. Snow fell outside, quiet and endless. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the worn collar tag she'd kept, the one that read, "If found, keep him." The circle was unbroken now. The dog saved, the man forgiven, the woman reborn. She realized that mercy didn't flow in one direction, it looped, finding its way back through every act of compassion. In the window's reflection, she saw all 3 of them, survivors bound not by blood, but by the stubborn insistence of life. The blizzard had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean and still.